Hi guys! Find us on social media and read the full article on our blog. Find out how to enter the US right now as a citizen of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Ireland, or South Africa. Over the past few months and weeks, we have gotten several comments asking how they can reunite with loved ones or visit the USA. So, this video is for all of you asking. We hope these tips will help you reunite with your loved ones. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown the travel industry into a frenzy. The United States, along with many other countries, has placed strict restrictions on international travelers, leaving many people wondering how to avoid the US travel ban. And while it's certainly not straightforward how international travelers can enter the US, it's not impossible. There are certain ways for European, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African citizens to safely and legally enter the US. What are the current restrictions for traveling to the US? With restrictions and rules changing practically every few months, it's hard to keep track of who is allowed and who is not allowed into the US. It's always best to check with your local embassy or the CEC guidelines for the most up-to-date information. Who is allowed to enter the US? US citizens, or lawful permanent residents traveling or residing overseas, are allowed into the US. You are also exempt from the travel ban if you are a government employee, airline crew member, or member of the US Armed Forces. Some family members of US citizens are also exempt. The following countries are also allowed entry into the US: Australia, Chile, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and Canada, air only. Although the US has not placed any specific bans on the above countries, there may still be travel bans enforced by the individual countries themselves. Australia, for example, has prohibited Australian citizens and pertinent residents from leaving the country. Finally, the US started to allow certain visa holders the ability to return to the US despite coming from one of the banned countries. B1 status visa holders, traveling for business. E1 or E2 visa holders. And J1 programs visa holders. Who is not allowed to enter the US? The US does not currently allow the entry of foreign nationals who have been in these countries the last 14 days. China, Iran, the Schengen area, the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and Brazil. The US has not banned individual citizens of these countries, only those who have been in the above countries in the last 14 days prior to their arrival in the US. For this reason, there are several workarounds, which we will show you in this video. So keep watching to find out. Can Europeans travel to the US? On March 13, 2020, the United States signed a proclamation prohibiting travel from people living or residing in the Schengen area. If you have been in the Schengen area in the last 14 days, you are not allowed into the US. You are only prohibited from entering the US if you've been physically present in one of these countries. There are certain ways how to avoid the US travel ban if you're a European citizen, which we will discuss a bit later. So keep watching. Can Australians and New Zealanders travel to the US? According to the US government, Australians are allowed to enter the US if they have not been on the list of prohibited countries in the last 14 days. Unfortunately, the Australian government has put in their own travel restrictions. Australian nationals and permanent residents are not allowed to leave the country unless you have been given an exemption. The exemptions are quite strict, but you can get one by telling the Australian government you plan to be out of the country for 3 months or longer. New Zealand citizens are also allowed to enter the United States, as long as they haven't been in one of the listed high-risk countries. Although the New Zealand government has advised against all foreign travel, there are no travel bans in place. That means New Zealand citizens are allowed to leave the country and can freely enter the US. Can South Africans travel to the US? South African citizens are allowed to leave the country and technically enter the United States. However, traveling to the US isn't as easy as it may seem, since South African citizens are still required to obtain a visa to enter the US. And since the US is not currently processing visa for leisure travel or tourist visits, this makes travel for South African citizens almost impossible. Most South African citizens will not be allowed to enter the US unless they have dual citizenship. Can Britons travel to the US? At this time, British citizens are not allowed to enter the US if they are leaving from the UK or any of the prohibited countries. However, there are certain workarounds that would let you enter the US. You just have to know how to avoid the US travel ban, which we'll discuss in a bit, so keep watching to find out. Can Canadians travel to the US? As of March 21, 2020, American and Canadian borders have been closed for non-essential travel, but only applying to land travel. You can avoid the US travel ban by flying from Canada into the US, as long as you haven't been in any of the prohibited countries. Depending on which US state you fly into, you might be required to self-isolate or quarantine. When you return back to Canada, you can either cross over by land or by air, and you will need to isolate for 14 days once you arrive back home. In addition, the US has closed its land borders for non-essential travel to Mexico. Tourists are not allowed to enter the US from Mexico or Canada unless they are US citizens returning back home. Check the exceptions in the CDC website. How to avoid the US travel ban. If you want to know how to avoid the US travel ban, then you'll be happy to know there are a few workarounds. And due to COVID-19 testing and quarantine restrictions, you can feel comfortable knowing that you can travel across borders into the US safely and legally. 1. Travel from a country that is not included in the ban. While the US currently has banned several countries from entering the country, this only applies to people who have physically been in those said countries for the past 14 days. Even if you're a citizen of a banned country, you may still be allowed to enter the US by traveling from a country that is not included in the ban. Although this is a technical workaround, please keep in mind that your entrance into the US is still determined by a member of the US Customs and Border Patrol. Being allowed to enter the US is not guaranteed. Which countries in Europe will allow me to travel to the US? While Europeans are not allowed to fly directly from a Schengen country into the US, they can enter the US from a non-banned country. One of the easiest countries for Europeans to travel outside the Schengen area is Croatia. While Croatia is part of the EU, it is not a country in the Schengen area. If you are currently residing in Europe, you can easily drive or fly to Croatia, reside there for 14 days, and then book a flight to the US. Bosnia and Herzegovina has also reopened to EU Schengen nationals in July. Although you will need to provide a negative COVID-19 test, it's still an option if you're wondering how to avoid the US travel ban. European citizens are also allowed to travel to Bulgaria and Serbia without any test or quarantine restrictions. Montenegro's borders have also opened, although some countries with high infection rates may be required to self-isolate or show a negative COVID-19 test. Romania is open to some Schengen countries. It's also possible for European citizens to fly into Turkey. There are currently no restrictions or mandatory quarantines for any foreign citizens entering the country. After staying in Turkey for 14 days, you'll be allowed to fly into the US. There are multiple non-stop flights from Istanbul to different cities in the US. 2. Visiting family in the US. Foreign nationals are able to bypass the travel ban if they have relatives living in the US who meet the following criteria. Do I need a visa to travel to the US? If you're planning a trip to the US and wondering how to avoid the US travel ban, one of your first steps is to find out if you need a visa. Through the Visa Waiver Program, the US has granted citizens from certain countries to enter the US without needing to obtain a visa beforehand. Citizens of countries in the European Union are allowed to enter the US visa-free for up to 90 days. Australian and New Zealand citizens are also part of the Visa Waiver Program. Canada is also part of the Visa Waiver Program, and Canadians are not required to apply for a visa. On the other hand, South Africa is not part of the Visa Waiver Program, which means its citizens must apply for a visa before entering the country. This makes traveling to the US during the pandemic tricky, as the US government has currently put a hold on issuing tourist visas for foreigners. Do I need to quarantine once I'm in the US? Now that you know how to avoid the US travel ban, it's essential to understand the different safety measures and precautions in place. Each state in the US handles travelers differently. Some states require that you show a negative COVID-19 PCR on arrival, while others may require you to self-quarantine for 14 days. While these restrictions can change at a moment's notice, it's still important to review the measures in place before you book a flight to the US. There are numerous US states that have mandatory quarantine measures in place, which could impact what you are able to see and do during your visit. If you're only visiting the US for a short period of time, you probably don't want to spend 2 of those weeks quarantined inside a hotel room. See the description for a link to where you can read more about the individual states' requirements. Have any questions about the US travel ban? IAM can help with your visa application to the United States, the UK, and other countries. If you need help with a US visa, a UK visa, or visa to Europe, including help with appointment booking obligations, IAM can help. For more information and advice on US immigration, UK immigration law, and US visa applications, or if you need any help or assistance, please reach out to your visa coordinator at IAM. Check out more visa news by IAM. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified of more visa news.